Hello, my name is Matthew Vaughn, and I am doing the final PowerPoint presentation about the sacred architecture of the Japanese culture for Dr. Adair's Art and World Cultures class. Why the sacred architecture is important to the Japanese. The sacred architecture is important to the Japanese because the temples and shrines were built for the respect for both Buddhism and Shintoism. Both Shintoism and Buddhism both share the appreciation and the respect for the beauty that nature has to offer. The Japanese worship the different forces of nature as the different gods of nature. Even Buddhism in the Japanese society require the worship and the respect for nature, including building their temples and shrines by the rivers and cherry blossoms throughout Japan. Many of these Buddhists and Shinto followers in the Japanese culture believe that the worship of nature would provide nutrients and guidance for their souls. The sacred architecture in the Japanese culture included the temples and shrines that were built during the ancient times in Japan. Not only did the sacred architecture include the temples and shrines, this type of architectural style also included the castles and palaces that were built during the time period. The castles and palaces were built in respect and honor of the Japanese emperor during the ancient times across Japan. Some of the Japanese temples consisted of the tall temple towers called the pagodas, which existed in Japan, China, Korea, and throughout the entire regions of East, Central, and Southeast Asia. What role did art play in the sacred architecture in Japan? Art played a significant role in the Japanese architecture, including the sacred architecture. Art in the Japanese sacred architecture was created with different colors during the ancient times in the Japanese history. There were different types of art that played a significant role in the Japanese architecture. The two different types of art in the Japanese sacred architecture were painting and creating statues of Buddha and the gods of Shinto. When Buddhism started to take root in the Japanese culture, the architecture started to take a deeper root in the Japanese culture during the ancient times. The Japanese architects painted pictures of the Shinto gods and masterpieces that depicted Zen Buddhism. Not only the paintings were important in the Japanese architecture, but these architects also created statues of the Shinto gods and Buddha. They also created the guardian statues for these temples and shrines. These guardians were created for these temples because the Japanese believed that these guardian statues protected the Buddhist and Shinto temples and shrines from forces of evil. Pre-Buddhism versus post-Buddhism Japanese construction. There are differences and different characteristics that define sacred Japanese architecture. In the pre-Buddhism architecture, the Shinto temples and shrines and other magnificent buildings were mainly built out of wood. As a result of these magnificent buildings being built out of wood, these buildings were constantly catching on fire, destroying all the beauty and glory that these buildings maintained. A few of these buildings were rebuilt at later time period. Most Japanese architects later figured out a different technique of rebuilding these structures. When Buddhism began to exist in the Japanese society, the Japanese architects had different techniques of reshaping architecture. The Japanese architects began building the temples and shrines with different types of stone, and they even used the different wooden pillars for these structures to stand strong for several centuries. These architectural masterpieces had to be rebuilt with strong wood and different types of strong stone for the building to withstand the weather. The roofs of these architectural masterpieces were still built out of wood. But the Japanese architects used certain different types of techniques that preserve the wooden roofs of these buildings, which still exist today. These architectural masterpieces today attract tourists from around the world to its beauty and glory. What outside influences inspired the Japanese sacred architecture? The Japanese architects were influenced by the different cultures across East Asia during the ancient times. The main region that influenced the Japanese during the ancient times was China. The Chinese shared a lot of their characteristics with the Japanese during the ancient times. The influences that China had on the Japanese were the writing system, pottery, architecture, and mainly Buddhism. The spread of Buddhism helped the Japanese shape and change how they built the temples and shrines and their other precious architectural masterpieces. A lot of these architectural influences still exist in Japan today because the Japanese kept their legacy well preserved into the modern times. One of these greatest Buddhist temples that was built during the ancient times is the Phoenix Hall of Yoduin. This magnificent Buddhist temple is in Uji, Kyoto Prefecture, Japan. This image of Phoenix Hall of Yoduin is found in Chapter 5, Figure 5.13 on page 98 in the 13th edition of Gardner's Art Through the Ages Non-Western Perspectives. It is also known as the Amida Palace, which is considered the celestial architecture because it is situated on a reflective pond. This magnificent temple was built during the Heian period in the year of 1053. The temple was dedicated built as a memory of Fujiwara Uramichi's father, Michinaga. Another one of the magnificent architectural masterpieces in the ancient Japanese history is the Kondo, better known as the Golden Hall. The Kondo was built in two different time periods during the ancient Japanese times. The Kondo is located with the complex of the beautiful Buddhist temples and shrines in Horyuji, Nara Prefecture, Japan. Inside the Kondo, there sits the statue of the Shaka Triad along with the beautiful statues of Buddha, with the temple and shrine complex. The statue of Shaka Triad was created during the Asuka period in the year of 623, while the temple complex was built during the Nara period in the year of 680. The complex was rebuilt during the 1960s after being destroyed by firebombs during World War II in 1945. The image of Shaka Triad is found in Chapter 5 in Figure 5.7 on page 94, while the image of the Kondo in the temple complex is found in Chapter 5 in Figure 5.9 on page 95 in Gardner's Art Through the Ages Non-Western Perspective in the 13th edition. One of the greatest architectural masterpieces that was built during the ancient times is the Osaka Castle. This magnificent castle is in Osaka, Japan, the second largest city in Japan. The Osaka Castle was built during the Sengoku period in 1583. It was built during the era of many civil wars throughout the region of Japan. The Japanese had unique ways of how they designed the architecture of this ancient castle during the Sengoku period. This architectural masterpiece was in use for emperors and other rulers from 1583 to 1845. This architectural masterpiece was rebuilt in 1931 with concrete because it was neglected during the last centuries after the 1868 fire destroyed it. It was restored in 1997 because of the damage it sustained from the bombs in 1945 during World War II. Another one of the Buddhist religious centers in the Japanese society is the Great Buddha Hall, known as the Todaiji. It is considered the largest Japanese wooden building in the world. It was built during the Nara period in 743 and it was rebuilt in 1700 during the 18th century. It originally had 11 bays. After it was rebuilt, this temple currently has 7 bays. The interior of this temple contains a golden statue of Buddha surrounded by the pure gold that gives Buddha all its splendor and glory. This image is found in Chapter 5 in Figure 5.11 on page 96 in Gardner's Art Through the Ages, 13th edition, in the non-Western perspective. Another one of the religious sites that is considered sacred in the Japanese culture is the main hall of the Materasu Shrine. It is dedicated to the well-known ancient Japanese religion called Shinto. The religion of Shinto is when the Japanese worship the forces of nature as gods. This Shinto shrine was built as a dedication to the Japanese sun goddess called Amaterasu. It has been rebuilt in every 20 years for more than a millennium. When Buddhism arrived in Japan in the 6th century, the practices of Shinto changed under its influences. This image is found in Chapter 5 in Figure 5.6 on page 93 in Gardner's Art Through the Ages, 13th edition, in the non-Western perspectives. This Shinto temple is in Izumi Prefecture, Japan. It was built during the Kofun period, but it was later rebuilt in 1993. Thank you all for your attention to this PowerPoint presentation about the Japanese architecture in the Japanese society during the ancient times.